The morning sun rose over the historic royal palace, casting golden rays on its towering walls and ornate gates. The sprawling grounds buzzed with life as tourists from all corners of the world gathered to catch a glimpse of the iconic landmark. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every angle of the majestic building, while families posed for pictures against the backdrop of centuries-old architecture. Amidst this lively scene stood rows of royal guards, their uniforms crisp and polished, exuding an air of quiet authority. One such guard was stationed near the main entrance, his posture rigid and unwavering despite the throng of visitors milling around him. His helmet gleamed under the sunlight, and not a single muscle in his face twitched as children pointed at him, giggling, or as curious tourists tried to snap selfies with him in the frame. To many, these guards were just another part of the attraction, a symbol of tradition and discipline. But to Greg, they represented something else entirely: frustration. Greg had arrived at the palace earlier that day, full of anticipation for what he thought would be a relaxing visit. But things hadn't gone according to plan. First, there was the long line snaking toward the ticket counter, stretching far beyond what he'd expected. Then came the steep price of entry, which left him muttering under his breath about how everything seemed designed to fleece unsuspecting travelers. By the time he finally made it inside, his patience was wearing thin. As he wandered closer to the guarded gates, Greg's irritation only grew. He noticed how the guards standing nearby refused to even glance at anyone, no matter how much attention they tried to draw. People waved hands in front of his face, whispered jokes, and even mimicked his stance, but the guard remained utterly still. To Greg, this felt less like professionalism and more like arrogance, an act meant to intimidate or belittle the very people who came to admire the palace. Adding to his frustration was the heat. The summer sun blazed overhead, turning the stone pathways into virtual ovens. Sweat dripped down Greg's forehead as he shuffled forward, feeling increasingly irritable with each passing moment. When he attempted to ask a nearby staff member where the nearest restroom was, he received only a vague gesture and a hurried reply in broken English. This small interaction pushed him over the edge, and he muttered angrily to himself, "What is wrong with everyone here?" It was then that Greg turned his gaze back to the guard, whose stoic demeanor now struck him as infuriating rather than impressive. All the pent-up annoyance from the day, the lines, the prices, the language barrier, coalesced into a simmering anger directed squarely at this one figure. Without realizing it, Greg began clenching his fists, his mind racing with thoughts of how unfair the whole situation felt. Little did anyone know, this rising tide of emotion was about to boil over in a way that none of them could have predicted. Greg's frustration reached its peak as he stared at the guard, who stood like a statue, oblivious to the chaos swirling in Greg's mind. The guard's unwavering posture, his refusal to acknowledge the crowd, and the sheer indifference radiating from him felt like a personal insult. To Greg, it wasn't just about the heat or the long day anymore. It was about being ignored, dismissed, and treated as invisible. His chest tightened with anger, and without thinking clearly, he decided that someone needed to wake this guy up. As Greg approached the guard, a few people nearby noticed his tense body language. One woman whispered to her companion, "What's he doing?" But no one intervened. Greg stopped just a few feet away from the guard, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area for something, anything, he could use to make a point. That's when he spotted the flower lining the edge of the pathway. It was filled with soft, golden sand meant to decorate the palace grounds, but to Greg, it became a tool for revenge. Without hesitation, Greg bent down, scooped up a handful of sand, and straightened up again. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Was this really a good idea? But before he could second-guess himself, his emotions took over. With a growl of frustration, he flung the sand directly at the guard's face. The grains hit their mark, scattering across the guard's helmet and sticking to his cheeks and eyelids. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as everyone froze, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The guard didn't move. At first, he blinked rapidly, trying to clear the sand from his eyes, but otherwise remained eerily still. His training kicked in, keeping him rooted to the spot despite the unexpected attack. But even though he showed no visible reaction, the tension in the air was palpable. Parents quickly ushered their children away from the scene, while others whipped out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Some onlookers shook their heads in disbelief, muttering disapproving comments under their breath. Gray, however, seemed unfazed by the commotion he had caused. Instead, he crossed his arms defiantly, glaring at the guard as if daring him to respond. In his mind, he justified his actions. He deserved it, Greg thought bitterly. If he hadn't been so stuck up, none of this would have happened. But deep down, a small voice whispered that he might have gone too far. Still, pride kept him from backing down. He squared his shoulders, ready to defend himself if anyone challenged him. But then, something shifted. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, and several pairs of eyes turned toward Greg, some filled with anger, others with shock. A man standing nearby stepped forward, pointing a finger at Greg and shouting, "That's unacceptable. How dare you disrespect someone doing their job?" Others chimed in, agreeing with the stranger. Suddenly, Greg realized that the tide was turning against him. What had started as a private act of rebellion had become public spectacle, and not in his favor. Before he could process what was happening, 2 security officers appeared, pushing through the growing crowd. Their expressions were stern, and their pace quickened as they zeroed in on Greg. One of them shouted, "Sir, step aside," while the other gestured for him to come with them. Panic began to creep into Greg's mind, but he masked it with defiance, refusing to show weakness. Yet, as the gravity of the situation sank in, he couldn't help but wonder, what have I done? The moment the security officers arrived, the atmosphere around the palace gates shifted dramatically. What had been a lively hub of chatter and excitement just minutes ago was now tense and charged with unease. The crowd, which had initially gathered out of curiosity, quickly transformed into a sea of judgmental stares directed squarely at Greg. Whispers filled the air as people debated what they had just witnessed, some expressing outrage, others disbelief. "You can't do that to someone just doing their job," exclaimed an older woman clutching her camera tightly. Her voice carried over the murmurs, drawing nods of agreement from those nearby. A younger man standing beside her added, "It's disrespectful, not just to him, but to everyone here." These comments stung, but Greg refused to let them show any effect. Instead, he squared his shoulders and glared back at the growing circle of onlookers, silently daring anyone else to speak up. Meanwhile, the guard remained eerily composed despite the chaos unfolding around him. After wiping away the last bits of sand from his face, he resumed his original position, standing tall and motionless as if nothing had happened. His professionalism only seemed to amplify the crowd's disapproval of Greg's actions. To many, the guard represented discipline and duty, qualities that made Greg's behavior appear even more reckless and unjustified. As the 2 security officers closed in, one of them addressed Greg firmly. "Sir, please step aside with us. We need to discuss what just occurred." Their tone left no room for negotiation. Yet Greg hesitated, his pride battling against the reality of the situation. He glanced around, searching for support or understanding from the faces surrounding him, but found none. Every pair of eyes seemed to condemn him, making it clear that public opinion was firmly against him. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking innocently, "Why did that man throw sand? Is he bad?" The mother knelt down, whispering something reassuring, while casting a sharp glance toward Greg. Even the youngest members of the crowd were taking sides, further isolating him. For a brief second, guilt flashed across Greg's face, but he quickly masked it with defiance. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for some bystanders to hear. Unfortunately, this half-hearted attempt at justification only fueled their anger. The situation escalated when another tourist, a middle-aged man wearing a bright Hawaiian shirt, stepped forward, pointing accusingly at Greg. "You should apologize right now," he demanded, his voice rising above the murmurs. This sparked a chorus of agreement from others, with several people urging Greg to take responsibility for his actions. But instead of complying, Greg clenched his fists and shot back. "Back off. You don't know the whole story." His defensive response did little to win sympathy. If anything, it deepened the divide between him and the crowd. Behind the scenes, palace staff hurriedly assessed the scene, ensuring the guard was unharmed and deciding how best to handle the escalating incident. One of them discreetly signaled to the security team, indicating that the matter needed swift resolution. As the officers moved closer, they exchanged brief, serious looks before turning their attention back to Greg. "Come with us, sir," one of them repeated, this time more sternly, gesturing toward a nearby side entrance, where they could address the issue privately. By now, Greg's bravado was beginning to crack. He glanced around once more, realizing there was no escape, not from the watchful eyes of the crowd, nor from the consequences of his impulsive decision. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time since throwing the sand, doubt crept into his mind. What have I done? He thought, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could dwell on it further, the officers stepped closer, leaving him no choice but to follow. With every step he took away from the crowd, Greg felt the stares burning into his back, each one a silent verdict of guilt. The cheerful ambience of the palace grounds faded behind him, replaced by an ominous sense of dread. Whatever lay ahead, he knew it wouldn't be pleasant, and that realization gnawed at him as he disappeared through the doorway, escorted firmly by the security team. Once inside the small, dimly lit security office near the palace gates, Greg found himself in an environment far removed from the grandeur of the royal grounds. The room was plain and functional, with a wooden desk cluttered with papers, a flickering fluorescent light overhead, and 2 chairs placed opposite each other. One of the security officers gestured for Greg to sit, but he hesitated, his pride still refusing to let him appear submissive. Instead, he crossed his arms tightly over his chest and stood his ground, glaring at the officers as if challenging them to say something first. "Sir," one of the officers began, his tone firm but controlled, "we need you to explain your actions outside. Throwing sand at a royal guard is not only disrespectful, but also illegal under our laws." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" Greg shifted uncomfortably, but quickly masked his unease with defiance. "I wasn't trying to break any laws," he snapped back, his voice laced with irritation. "That guard was just standing there like some kind of robot, ignoring everyone. I wanted to see if he'd react. That's all." The second officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Greg's justification. "So you admit to throwing sand at him?" he asked pointedly, pulling out a notepad to jot down notes. Greg opened his mouth to respond but stopped short, realizing how admitting guilt might work against him. Still, there was no denying the evidence. Dozens of witnesses had seen everything, and some had even recorded videos on their phones. Seeing Greg's hesitation, the first officer leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice steady but tinged with authority. "Royal guards are here to protect this palace and ensure the safety of visitors like yourself. Disrespecting them isn't just rude, it undermines their role and disrupts public order. Do you think it's acceptable to treat someone performing such an important duty that way?" Greg bristled at the accusation, feeling cornered. "It wasn't personal," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. I had a bad day, okay? The lines were long, people weren't helpful, and then that guard wouldn't even look at me when I tried talking to him earlier. It was frustrating." The officers exchanged glances, silently communicating their disbelief. "A bad day doesn't excuse reckless behavior," the second officer replied firmly. You chose to act out, and now you'll have to face the consequences. We take incidents like this very seriously, especially when they involve members of the Royal Guard." At this point, Greg's bravado began to waver. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to talk himself out of trouble, but every argument he came up with sounded weak even to his own ears. "Look," he said finally, attempting to sound reasonable, "I didn't mean to cause any harm. Can't we just forget about it and move on?" The officers shook their head almost simultaneously. "Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way," the first officer explained. "This isn't just between you and the guard. It's a matter of maintaining respect for our institutions and ensuring that everyone follows the rules. You'll need to come with us for further questioning, and depending on the outcome, formal charges may be filed." Hearing those words sent a chill down Greg's spine. Formal charges. The phrase echoed in his mind, amplifying his growing sense of dread. He thought about the videos circulating online, the angry crowd outside, and the possibility of spending the night, or worse, in jail. For the first time since the incident, panic bubbled to the surface, though he fought hard to keep it hidden. "Isn't there anything I can do to fix this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with desperation. The second officer sighed, softening slightly but remaining resolute. "Apologizing would be a start," he said, "but ultimately, the law has to run its course. We'll document your statement, review the evidence, and decide the next steps. Until then, you're not free to leave." With that, the officers stood up and motioned for Greg to follow them into another room for processing. As he trailed behind them, shoulders slumped and jaw clenched, Greg couldn't help but replay the events of the day in his mind. What had started as a harmless attempt to vent frustration had spiraled completely out of control, leaving him trapped in a nightmare of his own making. And as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him off from the outside world, he realized there was no turning back. The sound of a heavy metal door clanging shut echoed through the narrow hallway as Greg was led into a small, cold holding cell. The stark contrast between the opulent palace grounds and this grim, sterile space hit him like a punch to the gut. The walls were bare concrete, painted a dull gray that seemed to suck the light out of the room. A single bench ran along one wall, bolted firmly in place, and a faint smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. It was quiet, too quiet, save for the distant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As the officers stepped back and locked the door behind him, Greg's bravado crumbled completely. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the barred window on the thick steel door, his mind racing with thoughts of how quickly everything had fallen apart. Just hours ago, he'd been an ordinary tourist snapping photos and complaining about long lines. Now he was alone in a foreign country's detention center, facing charges he barely understood. Greg hesitated before finally sinking onto the hard bench, his elbows resting on his knees as he buried his face in his hands. For the first time since the incident, there was no audience to perform for, no crowd to argue with, and no security officers demanding answers. The silence pressed down on him, forcing him to confront the reality of his situation. "What have I done?" he thought, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. The frustration, the sand throwing, the angry crowd. It all felt surreal now, like something out of a bad movie. His thoughts drifted to the guard. What must he have been thinking when the sand hit his face? Did he feel angry, humiliated, or was he trained so well that he didn't feel anything at all? Greg couldn't shake the image of the guard wiping away the grains, calm and composed despite the chaos around him. That stoic demeanor, which had infuriated Greg earlier, now filled him with shame. How could he have let his temper get the better of him like that? Time seemed to crawl by in the tiny cell. Every minute felt like an hour as Greg alternated between pacing the cramped space and sitting motionless on the bench. His stomach churned with hunger, but even more than food, he craved answers. Would he be released soon? Would he have to spend the night here? And what about tomorrow? Would he be fined? Jailed? Deported? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. As the hours dragged on, Greg began to reflect on his behavior, not just today, but throughout his trip. He realized how much of his frustration stemmed from his own impatience and inability to adapt to unfamiliar situations. The long lines, the language barriers, the cultural differences, they weren't personal attacks against him. They were simply part of traveling in a foreign country. Yet instead of embracing the experience, he had allowed himself to grow increasingly irritated, letting small inconveniences snowball into full-blown anger. Throwing sand at the guard hadn't been about the guard at all. It had been about Greg's failure to manage his emotions. By the time a uniformed officer returned to escort him out of the cell, Greg looked visibly defeated. His shoulders sagged, his face pale, and his usual fiery energy replaced by exhaustion. "Come with me," the officer said curtly, leading him down another corridor toward an interrogation room, where further questioning awaited. As Greg shuffled along, his footsteps echoing against the cold floor, he couldn't help but wonder if this humiliating ordeal would mark a turning point in his life, or if it was only the beginning of something far worse. For now, though, all he could do was follow instructions and hope for leniency. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. He'd never forget this day, or the lesson it taught him about the cost of losing control. The interrogation room was even colder than the holding cell, with a single overhead light casting harsh shadows across the table. Greg sat slumped in a chair, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at the scratched surface of the table. Across from him, two officers flipped through documents and reviewed witness statements, their expressions unreadable. The ticking of a clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud, each second stretching into eternity as Greg waited for what came next. Finally, one of the officers looked up and addressed him directly. "Mr. Greg," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "we've gathered all the evidence related to today's incident. Videos from bystanders confirm your actions, and several witnesses have provided statements. Do you have anything to add before we proceed?" Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment. But how could he justify throwing sand at someone who hadn't done anything wrong? Instead, he shook his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I don't have anything else to say." The officer nodded and slid a sheet of paper across the table. It outlined the charges: public disorderly conduct and assault on a member of the Royal Guard. Greg's eyes widened as he read the words, his heart sinking further with each line. The penalties listed were severe: fines, potential jail time, and even deportation. For a fleeting moment, he considered arguing that it was just sand, but the memory of the guard's calm composure stopped him. How could he downplay something that had clearly caused so much disruption? "Given the circumstances," the second officer continued, "and considering this is your first offense, we'll recommend leniency during sentencing. However, the final decision rests with the court." He paused, studying Greg's face for a reaction. "Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" Greg nodded numbly, his mind racing. Leniency sounded promising, but it didn't erase the fact that he'd broken the law in a foreign country, a place where rules often carried stricter consequences than back home. What if the judge decided to make an example of him? Would he lose his job, his savings, his freedom? The questions swirled endlessly in his head, leaving him paralyzed with fear. After what felt like hours, the officers concluded their questioning and escorted Greg back to the holding area. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Another man, older and disheveled, occupied the adjacent cell. From the snippets of conversation Greg overheard, the man had been picked up for drunken behavior earlier that evening. Unlike Greg, though, he seemed unfazed by his predicament, humming tunelessly to himself as he leaned against the wall. Greg envied the man's apparent lack of concern. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the day. The crowd's gasps, the security officers' stern faces, the guards' unwavering silence. Each memory chipped away at whatever remained of his confidence. By now, he realized there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. All he could do was hope for mercy when his case went before the court. As midnight approached, exhaustion finally overtook Greg. He curled up awkwardly on the bench, using his jacket as a makeshift pillow. Sleep came in restless bursts, interrupted by flashes of the day's humiliation. In those moments of wakefulness, he thought about the people he'd let down, his family, his friends, and even strangers who might see him as reckless or entitled. The weight of their imagined judgments pressed heavily on his chest, making it hard to breathe. When morning arrived, the sound of keys jangling outside his cell startled him awake. An officer stood at the door, informing him that his hearing would take place later that afternoon. As Greg followed the officer out of the cell, blinking against the sudden brightness of daylight streaming through nearby windows, he braced himself for what lay ahead. For the first time in years, Greg felt truly vulnerable. There were no excuses left to hide behind, no distractions to divert attention from his mistakes. Whatever happened next, he knew it would leave a lasting mark, not just on his record, but on his character. And while the road ahead promised hardship, he couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal might teach him lessons far more valuable than any punishment a court could impose. The courtroom was small and functional, its wooden benches polished from years of use. A large emblem of the country hung on the wall behind the judge's elevated seat, symbolizing authority and justice. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as Greg, escorted by two officers, took his place at the defendant's table. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the collar of his wrinkled shirt, wishing he'd had time to change into something more presentable. Across the aisle, a representative from the palace sat quietly, a folder of documents in hand, ready to outline the case against him. When the judge entered, everyone rose respectfully. The atmosphere shifted instantly, becoming tense and formal. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Greg," he began, his voice steady but stern, "you stand accused of disorderly conduct and assaulting a member of the Royal Guard. How do you plead?" Greg swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He glanced briefly at the prosecutor before answering. "Guilty, Your Honor." The words felt heavy as they left his lips, each one carrying the weight of regret. Around the room, a few spectators exchanged glances, some shaking their heads disapprovingly, while others simply observed silently. The prosecution presented their case next, laying out the evidence, witness statements, video footage showing Greg throwing sand, and accounts from palace staff detailing the disruption caused. When the footage played on a small screen in the corner of the room, Greg couldn't bear to watch. Instead, he stared down at his hands, now clasped tightly together, as shame washed over him once again. When it was his turn to speak, Greg stood awkwardly, unsure where to begin. "Your Honor," he started hesitantly, "I want to apologize for everything. I didn't mean to hurt anyone or cause trouble. I let my temper get the better of me, and I deeply regret what I did." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I know my actions were disrespectful, not just to the guard, but to this country and its traditions. If I could go back and undo it, I would." For a moment, there was silence in the courtroom. The judge studied Greg carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "Mr. Greg, your behavior represents a serious breach of decorum and respect for our institutions. Assaulting a royal guard is not merely a personal offense. It undermines public order and the dignity of those who serve this nation. However," he paused, flipping through the papers in front of him, "we also recognize that this appears to be an isolated incident and that you have expressed remorse." Greg's heart raced as the judge delivered the verdict. He was fined heavily, a sum that made his stomach churn, and given a strict warning about future conduct. Additionally, he was banned from returning to the country, effective immediately. While relieved that jail time wasn't part of the sentence, Greg knew the financial and reputational damage would linger long after he left the courthouse. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Greg exhaled deeply, feeling both gratitude and guilt. Outside, reporters waited eagerly, cameras flashing as he emerged from the building. One journalist called out, "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Greg?" Shaking his head, Greg pushed past them, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't trust himself to speak without breaking down. Back at his hotel later that evening, Greg packed his belongings in silence. The room felt foreign now, almost hostile, as if the walls themselves judged him. He scrolled through his phone, wincing at the headlines already circulating online. Videos of the incident had gone viral, accompanied by captions like, "Tourist loses temper," and "Respect matters." Lessons from today's outrage. Friends and family had begun reaching out, their messages ranging from concern to disappointment. Each notification added another layer of weight to his shoulders. Sitting alone on the edge of the bed, Greg replayed the judge's words in his mind. Assaulting a royal guard undermines public order and the dignity of those who serve. It wasn't just about the fine or the travel ban. It was about understanding the ripple effect of his actions. For the first time in his life, Greg realized how interconnected people were, how one impulsive decision could impact countless lives. As he switched off the light and lay down, staring at the ceiling, he vowed to make amends, not just legally, but personally. This ordeal had humbled him in ways he never expected, and though the road ahead promised challenges, he knew it was also an opportunity to grow.